Okay, so we're finally in our collecting data um, unit, and this is where we're going to start to look at designing studies or how studies are designed also. We'll be talking about experiments and kind of different ways of coming up with samples that are appropriate. So it's not a whole lot of math that's going to be involved in this unit. It's a lot of terminology that you have to know. Okay, so try to get yourself familiar as possible with it. Okay, this is going to be an activity that we do in class. Okay. So suppose that we want to find out what percent of young drivers in America text while driving. So to answer this question, let's say that we're going to survey 16 to 20-year-olds that live in the United States and drive. So ideally, we would ask them all, but and that would be called a census. But contacting every driver in between 16 and 20 years old wouldn't really be practical. Way too much time, cost way too much money. So instead of questioning all 16 to 20-year-olds, we're going to choose a sample that will represent an entire population of young drivers. So a lot of this chapter is about choosing appropriate samples and kind of the best methods for choosing samples. Okay, so so some words that I said were population. So a population in a statistical study is the entire group of individuals about which we want, okay, where a sample would be just a smaller part of the population, and it's from the sample that you collect. You collect your information that you want to draw conclusions about your entire population. Okay, so within a population lies your sample. From your sample, you collect data, and from that data, you're going to make an inference about your population. Okay, let's take a look at a quick example. So we're going to identify the population and the sample that's being used in each setting. So a furniture maker buys hardwood in large batches. The supplier is supposed to dry the wood before shipping. The furniture maker chooses 5 pieces of wood from each batch and tests their moisture content. If any piece extends 12%, the entire batch is sent back. Okay, so the population is going to be all the wood pieces in the batch, where the sample is going to be the 5 pieces of wood that they selected and tested. Okay, so another one. Each week, the Gallup poll questions a sample of about 1,500 adult U.S. residents to determine national opinion on wide variety of issues. They use Gallup for election polls. If you've been following it, you may have heard of that. They've reported it. So the population here would be all U.S. residents, and your sample is going to be those 1,500 adults who actually responded to the survey question. Okay. So the idea of a sample survey now. So we often draw conclusions about a whole population on the basis of a sample. So think of it like, have you ever tasted a sample of ice cream and ordered a whole cone if that sample tastes good? Okay, so you would do this because you know that ice cream is fairly uniform. So the single taste does represent what that entire batch or tub of ice cream would taste like. So choosing a sample from a large, varied population is not going to be that easy. So here's some steps that you take in planning your sample survey. So the first thing that you should do is always define the population. It's important to understand kind of who you or sampling from. The next thing you're going to do is say exactly what you want to measure. Okay, in other words, that's kind of like defining your variables. A sample survey is a study that uses an organized plan to choose a sample that represents some specific population, and finally decide how to choose a sample from your population, which we're getting into now. So before we actually talk about how to sample well, we'll talk more. We'll talk first about how to sample badly, because it's actually really important to understand what makes certain methods bad in order to know what to avoid when trying to sample well. Okay, so how can we choose a sample that we can trust to represent the population? There are a number of different methods to select samples. So suppose we want to know how long students at a large high school library at a large high school do homework, right? So to find out, you go to the library and you're going to ask the first, let's say, 30 students that you see about how much time that they spent on homework, okay? I mean, this has a lot of problems, but one major problem would be they're going to the library to ask students about homework, okay? You're not going to get a true kind of representation of what time is actually spent for the population if you're just going to the library. Why? Because probably if they're in the library, the majority of them would be more, let's say, studious students that would likely spend more time on homework than others, okay? So this would be known as a convenience sample. So it's unlikely that this sample would accurately represent your population that you're looking at. So with the homework problems, it's not accurately representing the homework habits of all students, okay? Because those students in the library, they're likely to be not better students, but they're likely to spend more time on their studies. So this would lead to a bias, okay? So using a method that favors some outcomes over others. So the design of statistical study shows bias if it systematically favors certain outcomes. So bias is the result of a bad study design. It's going to consistently miss the truth about the population in the same way. So again, you're going to probably get with the going to the library to find out a homework time spent, they're probably going to over your ideas or your inference about the population would be that it would probably be higher than what the true hours per homework would be. Okay. So convenience samples are almost guaranteed to show bias. So are voluntary response samples, in which people decide to whether to join in a sample in response to an open invitation. So a voluntary response sample consists of people who choose themselves by responding to a general appeal. Voluntary response samples show bias because people with strong opinions, often in the same direction as the question, are most likely to respond. Okay, so you hear or watch TV or hear on the radio or whatever to call in or text in or write in. Many internet polls will pop up as you're on something and ask you to reply to them. Okay, all of these things, they rely on voluntary response. People who choose to participate in such surveys are usually not representative of some larger population of interest, okay? Voluntary response samples attracts people who usually feel strongly about an issue, okay? They often share the same opinion as how or who put that question out there. So it tends to lead to bias. Okay, so former CNN commentator Lou Dobbs doesn't like illegal immigration. One of his shows was largely devoted to attacking a proposal to offer driver's license to illegal immigrants. During the show, Mr. Dobbs invited his viewers to go to loudobbs.com to vote on the questions. Would you be more or less likely to vote for a presidential candidate who supports giving driver's licenses to illegal aliens? The result, 97% of 7,350 people who voted by the end of the show said less likely. What type of sample did he pull, and explain why? Okay, so this would be a voluntary response sample. People chose to go online and respond, okay? The problem was that those people were viewers, so they're likely to support his views. So 97% is probably an overestimate. Okay, so we'll quickly, we'll stop this video here.